welcome to Easy Like a Sunday Story, episode 14. This week I'm going to try something a little bit different, and I'm actually going to be reading the beginning of what is potentially a novel. I'd love to know what you think. I'd love to know whether or not you can familiarise with the character, and if you're intrigued by the story and would like to read on or listen to more. So any feedback would be much appreciated. This week's story is called Coast, and I hope you like it, and here it is. Coast. Chapter 1. Welcome to Heron Bay. Rachel's face was shiny with sweat, and the perfect Farrah Fawcett hairstyle she'd last seen in her mirror in London was now a Shirley Temple bubble perm from humidity. The 4 trips up and down the metal steps with her luggage finished her off. Always the bloody bag lady, she huffed to herself with the final heave-ho, annoyed at her lack of ability to travel light. She couldn't believe buildings still existed where the steps were on the outside, and cursed the heat it added to her labour. She was grateful they'd been coated in astroturf so Dolly didn't burn her paws and her bottom while she was sat waiting at the top for Rachel to struggle with her bedding. Not that she was going to sleep in it, she'd be sharing Rachel's bed, but it let her know that they were here to stay for a bit. Before she read all the bump from the email and worked out how to do the key code box, Rachel turned to take in the view. What do we think, dolls? Will this be the answer to our problems? Dolly panted and started sniffing the air as if to say, hang on a minute, let me check. Rachel looked out to sea. She looked beyond the distant tankers that reminded her of the battleships game from her childhood, and past the wind farm that reminded her of the colourful foil windmills she'd get from trips to the seaside. As she remembered the joy of blowing them and making them spin, she wondered if the engineers felt the same excitement when they got the turbines to work. Yes, there was a glimmer of hope that her imagination could thrive here. Rachel hoped so. She was running out of ideas and time. Rachel was a writer, although she didn't really feel she could call herself that. She had imposter syndrome, big time. She believed she was simply living proof of the theory that everyone had a book in them, and that was it. End of story. As it happened, hers had been a pretty popular book, and on the back of its success, she'd been offered a deal with the DeMarch publishing house. This was a dream come true for Rachel, but she never actually believed it would happen. If she had, she might have done things a little differently. Rachel was a natural storyteller, and she had the knack of putting a comical spin on things. She saw the funny side or the endearing side of situations, and had spent her life saving up anecdotes and filing them in her brain's story bank. This, coupled with her uncanny ability to get herself into farcical scrapes, had resulted in a library of tittering tales, jokes, profound metaphors, witty similes, all there waiting should the day ever come that pen was put to paper, or, less romantically, fingers put to keyboard. And now she'd convinced herself that her book's success was solely because of this lifetime's worth of saved up nuggets of brilliance. It was a shame she'd used them all up. It's a bit like eating all your sweets during the trailers at the cinema. Realisation and regret dawning at the opening credits that you've got nothing left. You should have made them last. Eat them out. So now Rachel was on a major writer's sugar crash. She was in the back row with a long way to go, and all she could think about was the rustling of everybody else's wrappers. What she knew it didn't do to compare herself, but she couldn't help it. The other writers with her publisher were so much more experienced. They were doing this for real. She told her story, it had come easily to her, it was cathartic, it was finished. What now? Well, now, in a moment of madness, Rachel had decided to find somewhere inspiring to write. Somewhere that wasn't full of her life of distractions and chores and a plethora of procrastinations. It was spring coming into summer, although freakishly hot for the time of year, and she'd rented a small cottage-style flat looking over the sea in a place called Heron Bay. She'd fallen in love with it from the pictures online. It seemed dated but clean, but it was the view that had captured her heart. When she'd seen there were double doors that opened out onto a balcony overlooking the beach, she felt sure that she would write her novel there. There was something about the sea. Its mysterious powers conjured something up in her. Maybe it was being able to see the horizon. It felt like the edge of the world and made her feel small, a tiny part of something much bigger. And if she was minuscule, then her problems and worries were too. Or was it the air and the sounds? They made her feel fresh and alive and always helped her smile. She was excited to start every day for the foreseeable future, breathing it in. She imagined it would make her feel very happy indeed. But it stirred her emotions in other ways too. A sunrise invoked hope and new beginnings. A calm sea, still with a texture of glass, allowed peace and tranquility, while roaring waves summoned excitement and courage. A sunset could call up many feelings: drama, fun, romance, reflection, loss. A sensation of things coming to an end. She was sure it would feed her creativity. And of course, discovering a new town and its people should tell a tale or two, she hoped. She gave Dolly a drink of water, but it had got warm in the car. Dolly reluctantly drank it and performed a choking noise to make clear that it wasn't to her standards. Sorry, dolls. We need to get you inside and cool you down, and I urgently need to find the loo. I promised the guy you were house-trained, and I'm pretty sure he's assumed I am too. Cross-legged, after much scrolling, Rachel found the bit in the email about the key box. Finally. Seriously, put the important information at the top. And why is the code so bloody long? It's not the crystal maze. Rachel was getting panicky about her desperate situation and was now bent in a half-seated, half-standing position as if she was doing a buttock stretch after a spinning class. Her face was exuding more sweat, and the wind had turned the Shirley Temple curls into a more Beetlejuice hairstyle, sort of scraggy, erratic rat's tails. She looked like an escaped convict whose exit strategy had involved reversing through a bush. After 2 wrong attempts at the code, Rachel resorted to saying the letters and numbers out loud to improve her accuracy. It worked, and she turned the handle. Hallelujah, she puffed with relief. As she pushed the door, bent double with the pain in her bladder, she fell forward. The door had been pulled from the other side. The surprise made her heart leap. Mid-fall, a little bit of wee came out. As she landed across the threshold, Rachel's face met with 2 large Birkenstocked feet on the doormat. She heard a strange, extended groan. It took her a moment to realise it was coming from her. The shock, the blow from hitting the floor, and the utter grossness of being so close to someone's feet increased its tone and warble as she tried to wriggle her face away from the crusty sandals. Dolly started barking and licking her cheek to make sure Rachel was okay. A bit more wee came out. "Oh my God, are you okay?" said the owner of the feet. Rachel knew it was polite to say, "Yes, I'm fine," and brush it off as no big deal, but she was mortified, frustrated, hot, and felt like her dignity was a lost cause anyway. Instead, "Are you trying to kill me, you lunatic?" came out. It was shouted up at him from the seated position on the floor that she'd adopted, afraid of any more movements disturbing her bladder. She was aware of the irony of the lunacy accusation. The man was wearing a pinny and bright yellow rubber gloves, and he held out a hand to help her up. "Sorry," he said. "I could hear you struggling with the door. I was trying to help." "No, thank you. I'm fine here," Rachel huffed, shooing his hand away. "I wouldn't have needed the bloody code if I knew the cleaner was going to be here. I've been out there 10 minutes trying to get in. It's really annoying." "I'm Seb. We've been emailing about the let." Seb held out his yellow banana hand again, this time offering a handshake. "You're actually a little early. Check-in is 3 p.m. His smile was jovial, but Rachel's vulnerable predicament took it mockingly. "Well, maybe it should actually say that on the email," she retorted. "It actually does." "Well, maybe if it wasn't 3 pages long with the vital information buried between pub recommendations and what days the bins are collected, people would actually be able to find it." "Okay, Miss Parks. I imagine you've had a long journey and would like some privacy. I'm just about finished cleaning anyway. I'll leave you to it. If you need anything, my number's on the email. It's after the bit about the bins and before the bit about the house rules." Seb was still using a friendly tone, but there was a definite sarcastic ping of the gloves as he removed them. He'll have to give them a good blow to get them back on, Seb thought as he did it. He usually liked to dry them and take them off finger by finger so they didn't turn inside out. He gently closed the door behind him and Rachel crawled to the toilet on her hands and knees, much to Dolly's amusement, who followed excitingly. As the relief entered Rachel's body, the realisation of how awful the whole interaction had been dawned on her. Her first exchange with a person she'd met in the town she'd be calling home for the next 6 months had not gone well. Firstly, she'd caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror in the bathroom, and it was not good. She wasn't particularly vain, but the hair and the sweaty red face made her resemble a woman on the edge. Secondly, she had definitely wet herself. Only a little bit, thankfully, but it was still less than ideal. She'd also spent the entire conversation, post-fall, sat on the floor. The dynamic had been a new experience for her and not one she would repeat. It was actual madness. Thirdly, she'd really been quite rude, and when she played it back in her mind, it made her cringe, inducing strange involuntary words and noises as she squirmed with discomfort. How she'd refused his banana-gloved hand twice, and she'd said she'd wanted to sit on the floor. Oh, God, la la la, wobbly la la. Rachel buried her face in Dolly's fur to make it go away. Let's have a cup of tea, eh? Make it all better. Rachel knew she'd be comforted by the healing powers that the brew would bring. Tea in hand, relaxed somewhat, Rachel was able to look around and take in the scene that would be her normal until the autumn. Despite the landlord potentially thinking she was weird and a bit of an arsehole, she couldn't help but smile. It was so cute. Yes, it was small and old-fashioned, but it had a charm that something more luxurious wouldn't have offered. Rachel couldn't afford luxury anyway. She was still pinching herself about the price she'd got it for, given the view. She'd assumed the catch was its lack of modernity and chic. Most of it was tired, and the bits that were newer were more changing rooms than grand designs, with a make-do and mend finish. The couch was a comfy, squishy two-seater, perfect for curling up on with a blanket and a good book. It was probably ancient, but it had been covered with a red gingham fabric that made her want to go on a picnic. It was opposite a working fireplace, which filled her with joy, and she knew Dolly would love it too. It seemed crazy to be excited by that in 30-degree heat, but she knew there would be colder evenings, and she and Dolly loved coziness and warmth. She hadn't a clue how to light it, but she was sure there'd be some guidance in Seb's 90-page guest manual. Yawn. He was obviously a detail man, she thought. The absolute opposite of her. Reading instructions of any kind filled Rachel with dread, which of course meant she enjoyed a life of never using anything to its full potential. But she felt it was a fair payoff for not dying under mountains of manuals and piles of patronising small print. Rachel was also sure that she would pick Seb's booklet up as a procrastination tool at some point when she was avoiding writing her masterpiece. There was a mishmash of furniture, a gorgeous 1950s style sideboard which took up nearly one wall of the room, with a record player on top, an oak ornate bookcase that would have looked out of place in a church, and an MDF shelving tower housing a small collection of vinyl. The room had definitely had stuff added bit by bit rather than being thought out and put together by a designer. The record collection was just as random, an eclectic mix. Some were cool, some respectable. There was jazz, soul, funk, Motown, there was country and blues. There was music from decades spanning the 20s to the 90s, and there was a lot of classical too. Then, much like the juxtaposition of the MDF amongst the oak and teak, there was some absolute trash as well. Rachel laughed out loud at Aqua's greatest hits. Yes, Aqua of Barbie Girl fame actually had greatest hits, and she marvelled at some of the singles, including We Like to Party by the Venga Boys and I Want to Sex You Up by Colour Me Bad. What a strange guy, she remarked to Dolly. She couldn't work him out. Not that she needed to, she reminded herself. She just needed to keep out of his way. The bookcase was of the same irregular ilk, with everything from Greek tragedies to Twilight, Mel Brooks to Russell Brand, Shakespeare to Shantaram. There were more than a few books here that she was looking forward to getting her teeth into, and she felt a surge of delight in her tummy. Rachel was already feeling invigorated by the change of scenery and decided to head out onto the balcony to start her to-do list. Well, several to-do lists. She would do daily ones, practical ones, writing ones, and a list of intentions that she hoped she might fulfill during her time here. Things like swimming every day, ambitious as she didn't like the cold, paddle boarding, ambitious as she didn't have a clue where to start and had some balance issues, joining a running club, maybe. Get fit, probably. Get up for sunrises, sometimes. Immerse herself in the community, shop small, find a favourite cafe, only drink brilliant coffee and write every day. That was vital. The small balcony had enough room for a bench seat made from pallets, thankfully covered with a foam seat and back, and the tiniest bistro table she'd ever seen with 2 chairs, one for her, one for Dolly. Some people may frown at letting a dog sit at the table, but Rachel felt at the table was absolutely fine. On the table, not so much. Actually, Rachel felt Dolly had nicer table manners than many humans and often better chat. Dolly absolutely hated water, but until Rachel got her cooling mat unpacked, she poured some cold water over her to cool her down. She wasn't best pleased about it, but trusted that there must be a method to her owner's madness. We'll get sorted and go in for a dip later. We have to get used to that sea, mate, if we're going to be spending time at the beach. It'll be too hot for you otherwise. Dolly barked back as if she understood, but she couldn't possibly. Beach days during her 2 years' existence had been few and far between. She'd been to Camber Sands once and avoided the water at all costs, concentrating on her stone collection in the shade. Senora! Dusha, dusha, dusha! Both Dolly and Rachel's ears pricked with alarm at the screechy voice coming from below them. It sounded again. Senora! Senora! Urgency and pitch increased. Rachel and Dolly nervously peered over the balcony. There was a slight, stylish lady wearing crop-tailored trousers, t-shirt and loafers, all with a subtle lilac tinge to match her grey lavender-tinted hair. She was very attractive with olive skin and Rachel imagined green eyes under her huge Prada shades. She was hitting herself on the top of her head as she repeatedly shouted, Dusha, dusha, dusha! Was she calling herself a douche? Funny introduction if she was. Or maybe she saw what happened with Seb and was calling Rachel a douche. Rude. Hello. Rachel tried to sound breezy and polite. I don't understand what you're saying. She spoke loudly and enunciated her words with an exaggerated mouth like she was talking to someone who was hard of hearing. The woman grabbed a watering can, poured some water and demonstrated by pointing at it, Dusha! And then she signalled her head. Dusha! She pointed to the balcony where Rachel and Dolly were sat. Dusha! Then she indicated the patio beneath them. Rachel had no idea what the woman was going on about. She pulled out her phone, pressed the mic and asked Google to translate what she thought was Italian. The word signora and the absolute chic of the woman had been the clue. Ah, doccia. The penny dropped for Rachel. Doccia means shower. Ah, the water is falling on you. I am so sorry, Rachel said. The woman didn't look very happy. Rachel looked down and could see through the gaps that her seating was below where she'd been drenching Dolly. Then Rachel did a weird thing. As she tried to explain to the lady what had happened, she adopted a very bad Italian accent and began to miss out words. Mia dogga, she very hot. I chuck her water on her, make her colder. Dolly looked at her like she was crazy, shifting from one pour to the next with a whine. She appeared to be cringing. So it was back to the phone and Google Translate for Rachel. Scusa, mi dispiace molto dispiaciato. Basically, sorry, I'm sorry, very sorry. Rachel had already peed off the landlord. She couldn't cope with being on bad terms with her neighbour too. Mi chiamo Rachel, il mio cane Dolly. Odd that she'd now stopped the Italian accent and was saying these Italian words with an awkward London twang. The lady didn't seem to mind. She smiled and held up her hands to signal peace. She appreciated Rachel's effort to speak her language, even if it was terrible. Mi chiamo Rosetta. Benvenuta. Rosetta nodded and went back to her soggy newspaper under the shade of Rachel's balcony. With Rosetta's welcome came a relief. There was something about her that Rachel liked. She was scary, but Rachel decided there and then that she wanted to get to know her a little better. She added, learn Italian and don't pee off any more locals to her to-do list. To be continued.